Nicol Kindness. Well, it's great to have you on the show. I learned about you the funniest ways possible. I bumped into you, if you will, by interrupting you in the middle of a podcast with our mutual friend Don Armand. And then lo and behold, came to understand that you were a fascinating creature. So let's start with you in your own words, Nico. Who is you?
Who is me? Hi, Minter. It feels like we've just been speaking about a week ago, which is pretty much what we did. Who am I? I'm a Scottish guy. I was born in Scotland. I live in Switzerland. I live in the Alps, and I was in the army for 9 years. I was an army officer, and then I was working on oil rigs, and then I was a consultant and had a ski school at the same time in in Switzerland. And then I was a stay-at-home dad, and now I do a bit of real estate and I do podcasts. But the podcasts are my hobby, that I get to speak to people like yourself and many others, and it's a great hobby to have. I'm sure there's more to it than that, but that's the structure of my life so far, pretty much.
Yeah, let's say there's more to you than there is. So Nico, let's start with the army story. 9 years. It always fascinates me, people who have done service for the country. What stimulated you to do that, and what's your takeaway from your 9 years?
Well, my takeaway from the outset, I would have to say that for me personally, it was fantastic for my life trajectory. And I'll explain why as I go through. But when I was younger, I had the idea to join the Marines, Royal Marines first in the UK, which I did a few of their, you do these courses, you go and visit them, and they decide if you guys like each other, if we like each other, and then you can progress. And I also at the same time did a visit with the army because I had a great uncle who was a very heavily decorated war hero in World War II. So I used to see him in the uniforms, and it was, you see these things and you see the movies on TV, and it's all about glory and honor and this and that and the other. The glory side of it never, I can't really say, was what attractive to me. But saying that, it probably was. But the honor, the discipline, the camaraderie, the challenge, all that was, I think that was probably the main thing. And I was also at the time when I got serious about it, I was having probably the lowest point in my life. So it was something I had to do because it was just getting out of control. My life was not very happy, and I just felt I was wasting away. And then I had this opportunity, which, it's not easy to get through the selection process. There's two selection processes you have to do, and you have to do them. Yeah, you got to. They either like you or they don't. And I have a friend whose father was the most senior general in the British military, and he didn't get in, and I got in.
You
So
mean your friend didn't?
he didn't get in. No. So it just shows you that it doesn't matter who your parents are, or it might if you're a royal. But it's merit based. Let's call it that. It's kind of a buzzword again nowadays. So to that extent, that was the reason why I wanted to do it, and I had a feeling in me, intuition. I'm going to call it intuition, which I was pushing me hard to do this, and so I did it, and I managed to get through. I went to the Sandhurst, which is the British equivalent of West Point. It's an officer school, which was tough but fun, and I learned a lot there because you're with some very, very impressive people, and you could have a bit of an ego about yourself from before you got there, about your fitness or your capabilities, but then you meet some extremely fit and extremely capable people, which is great because it makes you have to improve yourself. So that suited me down to the ground. I'm that kind of guy. I don't like to be shown up by somebody else, and call it
A
pride or
little
whatever.
competitive.
Competitive, yes, yes. Pride, whatever you want to call it, one of all these deadly sins. But And it gave me a great grounding, I think, for afterwards in life, because I was comfortable with all aspects, all strata of society. So that was what basically has put me on the track to where I am now in my life. And I, when I say my life was going nowhere, it really was going nowhere. I struggle to think what I'd be doing now if that was the case. So, and then by being able to, or having this, I mean, it's discipline. It's enforced discipline. It's not really self-discipline. It's mostly forced discipline. But being able to achieve things that you never thought you were going to achieve is very good for your confidence and especially being in the army, because a lot of the things you have to do are, it's a lot of off the cuff stuff, because as we say, or Mike Tyson said it best, is everyone's got a plan till you get a smack in the mouth. And
Mhm.
there was a lot of that was going on in the army. The plan was there, but it very rarely went to plan. So we had to improvise and come up with things. And then after that, nothing can really phase you too much after that, because you know that you can figure out a way to get things done. So that was very good for my life. And I still get phased. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely get phased by things. But when it comes to, just handling yourself in life, you know that you can dig yourself out of whatever hole you're in.
Let me just
Go
interrupt you a
ahead.
second. First of
No,
all,
no, no, please.
we're publishing this right after the discovery of the fact that Gene Hackman died, and how he admitted while in filming The French Connection that hitting somebody wasn't his gig, but once you hit enough people, then you start figuring out how to do it. That was just a rappel of that, but the notion of choosing the Marines over the Army in the United States, in any event, the Marines are really considered the toughest of the tough. That's what their motto is. Um, and your decision to choose the Army versus the Marines, was that really down to your uncle, because that he was the one who inspired you and everything
Mm-hmm.
he did? Because I mean, these are, you at the end of the day, they do make big impact, because it's the people you're hanging out with that end up being these guys and this brigade, or this, whatever group you have with you. But talk us through the difference between Army and Marines, Royal Marines.
Yeah. So I was very much attracted to, because the selection process is very tough for the Royal Marines. And that was what I wanted. I thought I wanted to do. I thought, and there was probably that scared little boy inside me saying, "I'll show these people. They've been mocking me." That kind of
Yeah.
things that you think about when you're a kid. And
Bravado.
well, yeah, there's bravado, but you have to back it up. And actually going to do
Sure.
that it takes some balls to go and do that in the first place. So,
Well, that's the
um,
gap between the bravado and the actual
yeah,
shit.
yeah. As I used to say in the military, you either shit or you get off the pot, and
Mhm.
that's an apt phrase for it. So I I went to do a few visits with the Marines, or one visit with the Marines. We were up in the Scottish Highlands, up and down mountains all day, which was really fun and very challenging, because I was, I don't know, 19, 20, 20, 21, early 20s anyway. And so this was my first, shall we say, introduction to that sort of level of physical activity. I'd done mountaineering and stuff before, but not to that level. And I really enjoyed it. And then I went to visit the army, and I thought, I felt more at home, shall we say. And then when when I sat down and thought about it, there seemed to be a lot more opportunities to go and do things at that time, for sure. That joining the army there's a lot more going on for the army people than there was for the Royal Marines. So, for instance, they were not doing very much. They were doing back and forth to Northern Ireland. They weren't doing the same. They didn't have the same reach, shall we say, that
Sure.
the army did.
Reach.
Yeah. And so I ended up doing bunch, because I joined at the right or the wrong time in the late 90s. and I was based in Germany, and I was in the armored brigade, so we were sent everywhere. So I went on all the operations that were going on. Or it was an exciting time. It was an exciting time, and it was a good time to join the army.
Right.
So
Well,
that's
so
why.
I wanted to go back to this sort of the young kid that you were, and struggling in life and such, as I understand it. Making choices when you struggle like that, it sometimes becomes very difficult because you're never sure of yourself. Everything's difficult. It's sort of dark and dour. I mean, I'm thinking that that's the
Mhm.
situation. What was it? A lightning bolt, a feeling of lightness and joy? How did it become the thing that you stepped into? Was it a meeting a person that just said, "Oh God, this guy I really admire," or what was it that allowed you to say, snap out of it into this decision?
Well, I'd hit rock bottom, basically. I wasn't. I was very unhappy, and I wasn't enjoying life. And I just had this feeling inside me the whole time. And I think everyone gets it, is that I've got more to give. I've got more to do in my life. And I was drinking too much, drugs, you know, hookup culture, even back then, um, which are offer temporary solutions. But at the end of the day, it doesn't bring anything. It brings you a hangover, or some nasty disease or something like that. But it's not what you. It's not how I. When I say it was my intuition, it was like I had this. I have to do this. I was desperate, and when I say I hit rock bottom, I was thoroughly miserable, and I thought, if I have to do this because I don't want everyone to think I'm a loser. Again, it's probably that little boy thing coming out again. Is I've got a lot to give. I just need to be put on. I need to be put in the right position to be able um, to excel at something, and luckily, I'm not saying that with the army was that, but it was certainly got me to where I needed to be. And I don't know if you remember, and we're showing our age a bit here, Minter, but the movie Officer and a Gentleman, when Richard Gere is doing the push-ups in the rain because he's been caught stealing stuff, and he's trying to get him to quit. And I had that too when I was there, and he's just shouting, "I've got nowhere else to go," and I had nowhere else to go. So that resonated. I remember thinking that it's like, there's no way that I'm not getting through this. So you can throw whatever you want at me. I'm not going to give up because I have nowhere else to go. This is my last. Well, I felt it at the time was my last shot to do
Sure.
something with my life. So that was a
The
powerful motivator when you're, you know,
the the
when you're
image I
skinned.
have, the image I have comes from another sort of scene where I think the sergeant major is saying, "Rather be marching up and down the yard, would you?" Um, I think you'll know where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
A certain John Cleese. I want to just to pick up a few words you used, because I feel you talk about these in a positive term, these specific terms. You say it was tough but fun, and it was enforced discipline. You're also being of service to your country. If I put those three things together, I feel like in 2025, none of those apply to the way we are doing things and raising our children, and as a society growing.
Hmm. Well, I would just go back to what I just said, that one needs to be put into or find themselves or get themselves into a position that they find something that they really, really want to do. And I think that's fundamentally, I wouldn't say it's missing right now, because I think the opportunities are out there, not necessarily going into the military. Um, just FYI, I'm very anti-war nowadays. So I've gone a bit full circle. But I think once you find something you want to do, you can eat any amount of crap if you really are motivated to do it. And I've taken the verbal abuse, not necessarily physical abuse, but it is physical abuse when they make you do all the punishment exercises, but they're not beating you up, although I'm sure they wanted to several times, and I'm sure I deserved it. But And then another thing is I figured out as well is that the whole thing was a game, and you were just basically playing a game. You just kept a smile on your face and just kept going. That's all you really had to do, and that's all they really wanted to see, that you were capable and that you weren't going to give up, and that you had a bit of backbone to you. So, there's. I remember when I was really young, there was a lot of the like scout masters or boys brigade masters, the people like that had been in they did done national service when that was mandatory. You had to do 2 years in national service up until, you probably know, late 60s maybe. I'm not sure, but they all said it was great, best thing they ever did, because it taught them self-reliance. And self-reliance that's what I was trying to say before. That's what the phrase I was looking for is. I think it's very important to have, and it's nowadays. It's difficult to say, but we came from a different era when you weren't mollycoddled to the extent I think is what's happening now. And I'm not being disrespectful to young people who are listening to this at
Or the
all,
mollycoddlers.
or the mollycoddlers. I understand there's perceived notion of crime everywhere, and I've stayed in a bunch of places around the world, and nothing's ever really happened to me, nothing major. So I don't know if it's this fear culture we live in, that the media are pumping out fear and politicians are pumping out fear nonstop. So I don't blame today's youth, the modern culture. I think it's almost like a propaganda that people must be afraid at all times, and that didn't really exist when I was a kid.
Well, let me just clear the record. I'm not blaming kids for the way they are. I'm
No.
far more pointing the finger at the people who are raising the kids and
Okay.
running society and governments and so on. And I'm far from needing war, wanting war. However, I'm focusing on the words you use: tough, enforced discipline. And it strikes me that this is all about building self-reliance and resiliency,
Mm-hmm.
and learning how to get up while you are soaked in sweat and covered in mud in terrible conditions, like in life. And my observation is that we have gotten away from this type of old-fashioned stiff upper lip stuff, and we've thrown out the proverbial baby with the bathwater,
Mm-hmm.
and said, well, we need to mollycoddle, as you put it. And so you're 9 years in the army. What did it teach you about life, and how has it really helped you develop into the Mr. Kindness that we know today?
It teaches you a lot of things, and I mean, obviously, I was put into a leadership role, so that's the whole point of what we were. When you do the
Sandhurst.
officer training, Sandhurst, yeah. So you do that, and you're drilled into it. You're a leader of men. This is how you be a good leader. And the reason our training was much tougher than the soldiers' training is because you can't be seen. I mean, of course, when you get to your regiment, there's going to be guys in your platoon who are fitter than you. That's just life. You get freaks of nature who can just run and run and run. But on the whole, you need to be the fittest, the smartest, etc. That kind of thing. The other aspect is what I learned was about teamwork and how to gain respect from your men and women. There was a few in our platoon. I was in the infantry, if you're listening, and that means it's almost all men. Well, it was in those days. I think it's a bit different now. But how do you gain respect? And there are, people would say that my style was, I was too friendly with the soldiers, but that's, you're supposed to maintain a level of aloofness, but that's not really my style. And when I see people who talk about leadership, and they tell they say, this is what you need to do. These are the qualities of a good leader, I think it's extremely or very individualized. Yes, those principles do work, but there's certain things you got to bring your personality into it as well. You have to have your own way of motivating people. And they say, the officers never ever complain. I used to complain to the soldiers all the time about my higher ups, but always joking about it. And but he still had to do it, right? But I was told that was a big no-no. But we'd laugh about it because
The
they were
hierarchy.
the hierarchy. Of course, you're not supposed to. Yeah, well, you're not supposed to belittle the ones of. You know what
Break
I'm
the
trying
line
to
of
say?
command.
Break the
Break the
chain of
line of
command.
command.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was, but I would make light of it and we'd laugh about it. And they're complaining as well. They don't want to come and complain to me, but then we just used to sit and we used to call them shimp sessions. And when you sit, and the guys would just give you all their grievances, which is pretty much every day. And there's different forms of leadership styles. So learning my own way of leadership. Not saying it was the best way; it worked for me, and I'm still very good friends with a lot of my soldiers. We're still call and text each other quite often, and I go and see them. I also learned that I could operate across the broad spectrum of society, and there were royals there when I was there, landed gentry, people from very, very wealthy families, Middle Eastern, what were they called? Sheikhs, with endless amounts of money. But you learn to get on with everyone, and you develop I'm not sure you've developed a personality for it, but you certainly recognize the social cues. If that's and that's done me very well because now I can, like I say, I'm pretty comfortable with almost everyone really. And what else did it give me? It did it. The biggest thing I think it opened my life to this world of possibilities that I had absolutely no idea existed. And when you put a bunch of motivated people together, and then you make them eat, you improve them, and then so we would go when we got leave. I'd like to ski. I'd like to climb and sailing, whatever it was. If it was interesting and exciting, I was in, and that happened. I used to get because of these guys. Like, well, I can sail. We'll go and rent a yacht and we'll sail around some of the islands in the Mediterranean. So no worries. Or we go climbing for a week, or we go skiing for a week, and that was a thing I really missed growing up. I thought that that life wasn't for me. I would never achieve that life. But then, I'm not saying we're making pennies really when you think about it going back, but there was also enough money to do that kind of stuff, and the army encouraged it as well. So we were encouraged to go and do these fun things. So things that I never would have expected growing up. It just opened my eyes to the possibilities, and I'm not going to say it's limitless, but certainly now, and that's what I try to instill in my kids, is that there is a big world out there. There's a lot of fun things to do, and it's up to you to go and actually do it. And I think that's very useful. So there we go. That's going back to what you're talking about, the youth of today, or the modern society rather.
All right. So the thing I take away from what you just talked about, Nico, is the fact that you had the sheikhs and the royals and the rich. The reason why I say that is that it's rather reassuring at some level that those folks think that Sandhurst is a good
Yeah,
place for them to go
yeah.
actually put their nose in the dirt, do 100 push-ups, sweat, toil, suffer,
Freeze.
and yeah, freeze,
Always
and
cold.
as opposed to silver spoon up my arse
Mm-hmm.
kind of approach to life, and I find that very wholesome.
Mm.
In the other thing you mentioned, which is something that is a regular topic for me, is this idea of the taste for risk. And you talked about self-reliance. You also have the adventures and doing mountain climbing, and then of course there's a little bit of a risk going and serving for your country when there might be people popping you off or not overly
Mm.
happy with you. But the notion of risk, how did it architect or inform your acceptance of risk, or is it just because you're a ski instructor or something that helped you know how to
No,
do helicopters?
no. I be honest with you, it started for me young. So my parents split up when I was 5. Excuse me, and so my mum was working. So I was the typical 80s latchkey kid, as you could call it. You'd come home from school, and we all lived in a pretty small town. So your friends were all
Up
nearby,
in Scotland,
up in Scotland, yes. And
Bonnie Scotland.
we'd just go out, just come home from school, take off our school uniforms, and disappear until our bellies started to rumble, and then we'd come home and eat. And then if it was light enough, we'd go back out and play again. And we used to get up to all sorts of stuff. And that is, um, for me, that is, I think, really important for a child nowadays is to, or not just nowadays, in all forever, is to go and get into trouble, get into fights, get your nose bloody somebody else's nose, you know, come home with blood pouring out of a wound because you'd fell, getting screamed at by your parents, playing sports, just doing all this stuff, which you alluded to before. Well, you didn't allude, you said it before. Is missing nowadays. We don't have there just isn't the trust, the societal trust that there was. I think when we were younger, when I was younger, for sure. And I lived in a pretty rural place, very very safe. And, murder and was just unheard of, right? In
That
Scotland,
that
the whole
wasn't the
country.
risk. The risk wasn't
No,
murder, but the risk could have been falling over, scraping, breaking a leg, or whatever.
falling in the river and drowning. But again, none of
Or
that happened, and we were all doing it. You watch out for that river. You might drown. There wasn't even a single story in our town of people drowning. So I think and I'm doing it with my children now because we live in a pretty rural place. As Dad, can I go and do this? Yep. And back at this time. And I don't have,
right.
my friends ask me, do you have trackers on your children? Those Apple trackers that you can, I said, absolutely not. You imagine how angry you'd have been if your parents did that to you,
Oh my
you know?
gosh. By the way, my father had one on him recently. Um, oh my gosh. But before we get, I want to talk about your podcast for the remainder. But before we do, I want to just circle back on this thing of ski school, skiing, Verbier,
Mm.
and how you've ended up. Why did you choose Verbier? Why did you choose
It chose
Switzerland?
me.
Maybe it chose you. How did that happen?
It
How do you
chose
let the
me.
wind blow that way? Because it's not a bad place to choose you.
No, no. So it's quite an amusing story. So I grew up, we used to go skiing in Scotland, and we're talking about risk again. We used to go on school ski holidays. We'd take a bus, I think 24 hours to Austria. It's a long way to Austria on a bus. This is before
Oh,
EasyJet and
oh, I thought you were
Ryanair.
skiing in Scotland.
No, no, we used to ski in Scotland at the weekends. And
Right.
then we'd once, 1 week a year, we'd go to the Alps, up to Austria. And we were just left alone, a bunch of 14, 15-year-old guys just building jumps in the off piste and trying to see who could jump the furthest. And so I always had that, and I really loved that aspect of things. And I, I just loved it. I think I just like mountains, and I like the snow, and I like the blue skies, and there's not much wind. And
Well, there's the freedom of the wind as you're
exactly,
blowing down without a helmet in those days,
I know that's
blowing down, doing helicopters, bump, 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 falling over, getting up,
backflips.
laughing, backflips, and all that.
So that, yeah, talking about that's the risk element again coming into it. Is I always kind of like risky things. I need a bit of, I like the adrenaline to get going. Not too much, but enough. So I ended up here because when I joined the army, and my CV, I'd written in my CV because I had to pad it out because I'd basically done nothing, and it was. I was in my school ski team, which is technically true, but we never raced because every time we were going to race, the weather was too bad, right? And so ended up, I got a phone call when I was still at training from one of the senior captains in my regiment saying, "Nicol, I hear you can ski." And I said, "Yeah, I can." He goes, "And you used to race?" And I said, "Oh, how did you know that?" And he said, "It's in your CV." And I thought, okay, yeah, I can I can brazen this out. That's not a problem. I can, yeah. So I blagged it, as we say, and so and he said, and I thought it was actually I was getting hazed. I thought it was I was going to turn up at the regiment and they were just going to laugh at me. And he said because the questions were, I said, well, where do we go? And he says, a place called Verbier in Switzerland. And I said, okay, I've heard of it. And are we in uniform? Are we living in a barracks? Are we doing gate sentries? All the boring nonsense. He said, no, it's all civilian. We rent an apartment, and and they said, well, we ski every day from 8:30 to 4:30, apart from Sundays. And I said, what about the evenings? It's like, do what you want, go to the pub.
Well, I was thinking you were asking whether on Sundays you had to go to church.
No, they were just telling us we had a Sunday off, which meant that Saturday night used to go nuclear, right?
Naturally.
And so, and it was £600. That's what it was going to cost me for 6 weeks. And he said, and if you qualify, if you get into our race team, then you go to France, and then you do a couple of weeks racing there. And then if we do well there, we go to another place in France for the army championships. So you're maybe away for 2 months. And I was like, okay, this is too good to be true. But this is it. I turned up on my first night here. I just had this feeling that this is where I was meant to be. And you can't ignore those feelings, Minter. When you get that feeling of something like this feels right, you have to investigate. And it took me a good few years to actually move here, but I did
Well,
eventually.
your intuition spoke again. And of course,
Yeah.
and the last question really, which is, your whole philosophy of life, you've moved to Verbier, you have kids, you also have to onboard your spouse in that whole story. What words of wisdom do you have in this element? Because at the end of the day, if it's not a happy, full family, it doesn't work for everybody.
No. Well, you have to be careful of who you choose as a spouse. That you have to have alignment when it comes to things you like to do.
Well, and like
So
things like sending the kids off without a helmet and doing risky stories, stuff
yeah,
like that.
my wife's a Swede, so they wear I can't do that. The kids have to wear helmets, so that's fair enough.
I'm only kidding about that helmet story, but the idea of sending them to allow them to do risky stuff.
Oh, I do. Yeah, and I'm sure I have a good relationship with my son. He's older. The younger one's only 4, so he's 10. And so we have a good relationship that if he gets in trouble, he'll come to me and tell me, and I'll help him out if necessary. So I'm quite good like that. And because I tell him all the daft stuff I used to do as a kid, and then he's like, wow,
What?
yeah,
You mean you
I'm
were
not even,
imperfect?
yeah. So yeah, it's alignment of what your passions are in life, and it's not necessarily just skiing. I like sports. I'll even play golf. I used to play a lot of golf when I was
There
younger.
you
I
go.
haven't, yeah, I know. I don't play it anymore so much. Whatever, really. But I like skiing. I lived in the mountains. I lived in a great place. She came here and she really liked it too. And I had to go skiing with her just to make sure that if she was absolutely hopeless, then this is it's
It's
not
a
going to
no-go.
work. It's not going to work. So we did that, and she was quite keen. She's a very good horsewoman. She used to do a lot of jumping, and she played polo and things like that. Yeah,
That's serious.
that's pretty hardcore.
My
That's
roommate
a
at university was a 10-goal player, so I'm
wow.
fairly
Yeah,
familiar with polo. Not that I
that's a
played, but
dangerous sport.
it is, and actually
Very
skiing
dangerous
and
sport.
horses in general. But
Yeah.
let's now focus the last part of our chat on your podcast. So,
Okay.
ordinary people with extraordinary stories. What made you start your podcast, the Mr. Kindness podcast, and how has
Yeah.
the journey of conscious growth evolved since it began?
Yeah. Well, again, it was an intuition thing. This overwhelming feeling was to start something. It's the creativity aspect of life. I think creativity is very important. Not saying everyone has to start a podcast, but doing creative things is, I think, very important for excuse me, for a good life. And especially when you get
Why?
into
Why? Why?
Why? Because I think um, the creative nature of us as humans is, it's basically squashed out of us as kids. That art, that's for girls. Poetry. What are you? Some sort of, insert
Wacko.
slur here. Yeah. But very, so you move away from that aspect of creativity as a kid, and then we almost lose it, and you become a worker, right? You become a drone, a slave to the system. But that's also fun too, and it can be also very, very creative. The army was very creative. You had to be very creative, and you were praised for showing a bit of creativity and imagination in what you did, and a bit of flair, a bit of dash, a bit of panache. Um, so, oh gosh, I've just completely. Oh yeah, so the podcast. So that was. I think when you mentioned the creativity, you threw me out.
Yep.
Um,
That's sort of what I do.
yeah. So as a stay-at-home dad, you spend a lot of time with kids, and I was basically starving for intellectual conversations, and so I actually started listening to the podcasts. That was a good 10 years ago, and I found a lot that I liked, some that I still listen to, and I took inspiration from many different ones. Historical.
Give us a couple of examples that turned you on.
Oh, okay. Dan Carlin's Hardcore Histories is excellent.
Sure.
Do you know
Hmm.
Dan Carlin?
Of course I do. Hmm.
He's amazing. I like to dip in and out of Joe Rogan if there's a guest on there
Hmm.
who I'm interested in. And he gets a lot of really great guests, so he's obviously, that's why he's number one at that. There's one called Tinfoil Hat, which I really enjoy. It's a conspiracy one.
Nice.
I enjoy all that sort of stuff. Tinfoil Hat, it's called, and he's a comedian, but it's pretty nuts, and he gets all sorts of whack jobs on there. But anyway, and a lot of the historical ones. But the point being is that I thought to myself, like, if I do this, I can speak to people like we're doing, eye to eye. I know we're not physically eye to eye, but through a screen at least, and have a conversation for an hour. And I mean, there's no way on earth. I said this to Don Armand. We were just saying that you would have, if I said to you, "Can I just have a FaceTime with you for an hour?" And you, who is this guy? But I managed to persuade enough people to come on and talk about things that I find interesting, and that's basically all it was. And I'm not really necessarily interested in getting superstars on.
Ordinary people, as they
Just
say in
regular
your tagline.
folks, who've done something really cool and interesting, and it's brought me a level of, without sounding like a total dick, spiritual ascension. I've started to learn how things work, and to be honest, I think everyone knows how it works. It's just a lot of we ignore it. I think what I would say, but how the story tends to go the same way. It's life is going okay, and then suddenly something happens, and you're plunged into a pit of despair. And it's how you deal with that pit of despair, your low point in your life, where people, I've talked to people who not only had contemplated suicide, but had bought the gun, the bullets, and the time and date they were going to do it, right? And that's also a fascinating story, is what happened to stop them killing themselves, for instance. And that's an extreme example, of course. But and the other side of that hole you come out of leads to a better life, and it's a part of the difficulty and hardship that we put ourselves through is how you deal with it, and can you, at the very least, you're going to come out of it a wiser person. And just some really fascinating stories. People who are going to the North Pole, a guy who got attacked by two great white sharks at the same time while surfing in South Africa. Yeah. Crazy. The crazier the story, the better for me. But the theme always seemed to be the same. It's just, I'm not saying go and surf next to great whites, but
If possible, with two, because
if
that way
possible with two
they
or
probably get
three.
distracted by one another.
Yeah. And it just, you hear over and over again similar. It's not the same context. It's not the same, but it's the same subject. And you've got people who then go on and do quite incredible things because they've, a bit like myself, either been in a state of desperation and a will and a yearning to improve themselves. You know, I'm talking divorced with 3 kids, young twins, and an older husband buggers off, and now she's a very famous and well-respected polar explorer. You know, things. You know, that's from being a housewife to going and doing that's an interesting story, right? And
It certainly is.
so that's what I like to do, and I like to get a broad range of people because I don't really think I have. I mean, I haven't really got an expertise in anything, and if I do, it's very narrow, and it would get quite boring for me after a while talking about the same thing over and over again. So that's why I like to get a wide range of guests to come on and basically talk shit.
I love it. I want to just circle back on one thing you said and disagree with you, which is I think well, the way I heard it was that you say everyone gets it, gets this idea of conscious growth. I would, and you say some people sort of ignore it. I actually don't believe that
Really?
everyone's aware of it. And I think that a lot of people just surf through life, live through life. For example, people in deep hardship in Soweto or a sort of a slum in Mumbai, they have this is not at all on their plate. Then there's a whole raft of people who think that it's all about me, and I get to live. I should be allowed to live forever. I deserve to be immortal. Oh my gosh.
Mm.
So I don't think either of these is really ignoring it. I think
Mm-hmm.
neither of those examples actually knows about conscious growth and the power of being egoless and being of service to some bigger cause.
Mm.
It's neither of them really have to do it. One has to get food on the plate for this evening, otherwise we die. And the other is really all about me and how big an ego can I satisfy and feed.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I agree. But I would also, I'm going to give you a caveat. Based on where I live, it's quite it's a lot of wealthy people come here. And skiing has got that image, I suppose you'd say.
My
And I
father lived
see,
in Stad, by the way, for
oh, well, there you
20.
go. That's
So I
the
kind
most
of know.
expensive
I
real
kind of
estate.
know a little bit about those type of places.
I saw that. I think I saw that today. It's the most highly concentration of wealth in the
The
world in
billionaires, yeah,
Stad.
yeah.
Yeah. So
1,600 billionaires. That's the number that sticks in my mind. But
blimey.
anyway,
Yeah.
something like that.
Well, holy moly. So,
Yeah.
um, but you see it. I see it. The children of some of these people, and these people, some of them. I'm not talking about billionaires, but people with a bit of money who they're using pleasure. The pleasure is where we're going to go, which restaurant we're going to be at, how much am I going to spend on wine tonight? Am I going to drop 20 grand on a bottle of wine or something stupid like that? And it's all about, that is all ego. But do you not think that people get to a certain point in their life that they find it just completely boring and pointless? Because
Well, I mean, I think that there are two typical examples. The first one wakes up having almost died, and then all of a sudden they switch on, and oh my God, actually, everything I've been thinking about, my fourth house in Courchevel, isn't actually the most important thing in life.
mm,
And the second one is you get older, and you actually determine that you only have a couple of years left, and then working 60, 80 hours and slagging off waiters in restaurants and being nasty to your spouse and having a couple of mistresses isn't actually the most noble and beautiful thing. So
no.
there are ways that people finally come around to it, but I find that if 65% of employees are disengaged at work, if mental health is skyrocketingly
Mm,
poor, I would argue that as a society, we are far from actually getting it right.
mm-hmm. Yeah. But there's I mean, there is a crisis. I think there's an existential, you can feel it in the world right now. It's almost like there's an existential consciousness crisis
Yeah, absolutely.
going on. And people are cracking and there are mental health issues. And, I wouldn't, I wouldn't even dare to say that, pull up your socks, go and get cold and wet in the mountains running around is
Run off to Sandhurst.
yeah, it's not that might not, that probably isn't the answer. Um, but it's just, it's almost like a collective despair that people have, that how is it that things have got so bad and it's so corrupt and there's these absolutely pointless wars going on, that I'm not surprised. I'm really not surprised that we're in the situation as it is.
I may, though. I mean, there is war, sure, but there aren't so many of us who are actually on the front line dealing with
No,
bullets,
no.
right? So there is war out there. We want to appropriate it. I would even call it cultural misappropriation at some level. We want to say, "Oh, look at my gosh! Look at this war. It's terrible." From my sofa. Gosh,
Mm-hmm.
that's really bad. Let me serve me another drink, please. And oh my gosh, but worry about my broken finger, worry about stuff out there, but actually disengaged from my true reality. I
Mm-hmm.
want to finish with one last question for Nico, because I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean to overstorm. You've had some great
No,
people on your show, from
thank you.
Nick Stevenson, Sir Nick Borton, Chance Garton, Charlie Stewart, lots of really interesting people. Um, of all the stories you've heard, and this is a choice factor, which has been the most memorable and impactful for you personally?
It's an almost impossible question to answer.
Naturally, well, I want to be a
It's
little
a
bit
tough one,
nasty.
but
Yeah,
I've listened to, like I said, I've done 129, I think now.
nice.
Um, I did one recently, and that his name is Ben Ward, and he's a guy who went to Norway with his girlfriend and up in the fjord somewhere up north, uh, about halfway up Norway, but that's still very far north,
Near
and
the
it's
Arctic.
not far away. And he's on the longest inland fjord in, I think, in the world or something like that. And he went there with his girlfriend. They were going to buy a property and renovate it, but they wanted to get away. They wanted to go into the nature. That didn't work out, that relationship. So he bought a farm, and he had that feeling we were talking about, this gut feeling that I belong here. Uh, this is something I have to do, and it's almost like you've got a virus in your head that doesn't matter what you can't get out of your head until you've made this decision. And that's, I could say, and having done all these podcasts, when I say this, I can say this because other people have told it to me. It's this incessant voice in your head, and call it what you want. Call it intuition, your guardian angel, God. I don't really care. You can't really ignore that message. But he bought this old farm with the intention to renovate it, and then he couldn't get the money because he was a
I
British
assume this
person.
farm is in Norway.
Oh, it's in 60. Hasn't been, yeah, on the side of a mountain with a very narrow track. You can only get up there on a quad bike. Um, it freezes over in the winter. It gets rock slides in the summer, and it has to go and clear it manually. The farm hadn't been inhabited for 60 years, and he had no money, and he was doing everything. And he went into he's a house builder by trade, a carpenter or whatever you want to. He works with wood, and he's very good at it. And so he actually went into the despair of having, just everywhere you look, you see 1,000 jobs you have to do, which is a good metaphor for life in general, right? And but the loneliness was getting him, and to the point that he was drinking too much. And he actually, when he bought that farm, he didn't realize that further up the side of the mountain, on the top of the mountain, was a cabin, which came with it. He didn't even know it when he bought it. He didn't know about it. So he would leave. Oh yeah, and so he's up there on his own, right, doing everything on his own. Uh, Running water, but no, or very little electricity. No, at the start he had no running water. and lived in a tiny, tiny cabin, like the size of a shed, right? And he went up to the top of the mountain. He said, this is too much here. I'm just going to go up there with food. I'm not going to bring any alcohol, and I'm going to go up there and just be on my own, which is kind of ironic because he's already on his own, but it was just to get himself away from the stressor being the project. And he went up on the top of this mountain. That was his happy place, even more remote. No phone signal, nothing. So it's completely alone. And he said, all I did was just sit there and think. And he would stare at a candle in the dark or the fire and meditate. And he had a breakthrough. He had a, Jesus in the desert type of moment, when you suddenly things
Jesus
become
the
clear.
carpenter,
Jesus the carpenter,
carpenter.
Ben the carpenter, and Jesus, and he was up there and he figured it out. And I call that podcast "Cracking the Code" because he's cracked the code. And he came to realize that there were three voices in his head. There was the negative, the ego side, shall we say, and his intuition. We'll go with that. So you got his own mind, his ego, and intuition. He puts it slightly differently, but that's how I can reconcile it in my head. And that the ego, and it's not, when I talk about ego, we're not talking about how you look in the mirror. It's what you've been built up. It's your shield you built up through your life, which is there to protect you. And that's very difficult to get out of that shield.
It serves a purpose.
It serves a purpose, but it's a hindrance. It's a big hindrance. So we're all should be trying to shed that ego. And he realized that the ego is trying to keep him in the same place, and his intuition is trying to get him to the next level. And so what happened was he had the negative voice, and the negative voice was keeping him where he was, and the positive voice was trying to push him on. And then so he learned to recognize the negative voice whenever he saw it, whenever he heard it. I mean, and then he would concentrate on on the positive aspect of things. And I'm not going to tell you it's just about thinking positive, because there's a lot more to it than that. It's actually, you have to recognize the negative voices
100%.
and then but also recognize the positive voices. There's that polarity in us, but you can choose to listen to either or, and most people will probably do a bit of both. But the challenge would be to only go listening to the positive voices. Do you see the difference? I mean, I'm not talking about living in positivity all the time. And
No,
being
I think
deluded.
I would argue that they both live there, and oftentimes we create a narrative that's the way I am.
Mm-hmm.
I live in the negative, I live in the positive, and that's the only way there is. And as soon as something comes up that destructures or pushes you off balance, you can break down. But like Stoics say, it's really how you deal with the shit that counts. And
so that's what
how to rewire.
Yeah. So that's what he learned. He learned Stoicism. And I mentioned in the podcast that by staring into the candle, I think that was Rudolf Steiner, one of his techniques for getting into an altered state of mind, was in a dark room staring at a candle.
Mine is a dose of LSD, but
Oh, okay, yeah. Or he could do that. He didn't have any LSD. I'm sure he would have done if he had it.
Well, I mean, frankly, looking at the stars is the same, but
yeah, exactly. So,
on top of a beautiful mountain.
Yes, and so that was, for me, was a real eye opener, and it made a lot of things clear, because the questions I've always had, and I always ask people who seem to have figured things out, and they said the answers aren't outside you, they're within you.
No.
And I said, yeah, okay, but how do I find them? And then he really quite eloquently explained how it works, and you can't really get your answers from anywhere else. And I guess that's the lesson that I took from him. And don't get me wrong, I'm not some virtuous man who makes no mistakes. I'm very much,
despite your lovely last name.
I'm a mere mortal, Mentor. I'm like everyone else. I have a path, but it's quite meandering. But I have a goal in mind. And so it meanders between good and bad. Of course it does, but everyone does, you know. And it takes.
Uh,
And I saw something the other day, or read something the other day, which was talking about if you've come to the realization that there is a path to um, nirvana, whatever you want to call it, your spiritual growth or whatever it is you want to, yeah, spiritual growth, let's call it consciousness, raising your consciousness, is once you've realized that you want to do that, that's the first step. And that's when you start to realize that it's not some easy path. It's actually a very, very, very rocky road, because you have to unlearn a lot of things that you thought were facts, were true. And so that's another thing I've taken from the podcast. So I mean, that's a podcast on its own, that very subject.
well, I love it. I was on a mountain on the northwest of Norway called Gruteya, and it's a pretty rugged environment. And you can learn a lot by actually feeling the rigor of nature as well, and
Mm.
coming to grips with how small we are on this little old planet that we live on. So lovely stuff, Nico. So tell us how we can follow you, track you down, get on your find your podcast, first of all,
Yeah,
listen to
find the podcast. Well, it's the podcast is the Mr. Kindness podcast, and it's MISTER kindness. That is Mr. Kindness _pod on Instagram, which I need to get more active on. My friend Ben the Carpenter, he's very good at it now.
all the way up in his mountain.
Up in the side of his mountain, the side of the fjord, and I'm at Mr. Kindness on X. And where else am I?
On LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, at Mr. Kindness on YouTube. So all these, you can see Minter on there. He'll be on there later on this evening or tomorrow morning. And yeah, or mrkindness.com, MISTER kindness.com for all the episodes. I know my website is really very basic, but I've got other things going on in my life, but I need to get that sorted out.
It's all beautiful. It's a work in progress,
It
like
is.
life.
It is.
Multi thanks. Been a pleasure having you on chatting, and thanks for the honesty of your conversation. Hopefully, some fun, enlightenment, and light for those who are struggling, and for others who aren't having on the path, a little wake up call to go out and find your path, find your verbier.
Yeah, and I think and I was always, one of the reasons that was holding me back, ego again, about starting a podcast was, who do I think I am? Who do you think you are? My friends would say, who do you think you are, thinking that people want to listen to you? And everything I thought about it, that they'd give me a hard time and call me a dick and all that sort of stupid stuff, none of it's happened. I mean, it's probably going on behind my back, but it's not to my face, which is a nice thing.
Listen,
But
if everyone
overwhelmingly,
if everyone loves you, then you know you're doing something wrong.
yeah. Well, but overwhelmingly, the feedback has been positive. I get good constructive criticism, mainly from my wife, but it's just that is one of the things that holds people back from being creative. And if you just pick up the brush or whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's hard to tell people what to do. You have to know what you want to do yourself, and you have to listen to what your intuition tells you. So, I mean, if that helps anyone, and if you want to come on if you want to come and talk about it, come on and let me know. We can discuss the journey.
Many thanks, Nico.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Minter, and we'll stay in touch. You're a fun guy to hang out with online, and I'd like to meet you in person. So that'd be fun one of
For
these days.
sure.
All right.